Hello, friends. Well, we have finished 4 chapters in 1 John, haven't we? With just 1 chapter to go, and then we'll begin a study of 2 John and then 3 John. Today I want to talk with you about a few points from 1 John chapter 4, verses 13 through 21. Of course, we are right in the middle of probably the longest treatment of love in the New Testament, especially the longest treatment of brotherly love. So love is an important subject to John, and it's an important subject to all of us who want to please God, right? And I'm sure you've noticed that there are really 2 things that John wants to do so far in this letter. One, he wants to reassure the Christians that they are right with God, that they have nothing to worry about. He's trying to give them blessed assurance. And the second thing that he wants to do is to counteract the false teachers who have wreaked such havoc upon the churches to whom he is writing. So he counters the false teaching of these false teachers, which has to do primarily with the identity of Jesus. And as you can tell from this text today and from previous texts, these false teachers, we'll call them the secessionists, those who left the church because they never really were part of the family of God. John wants us to know that they were not loving one another. And this was one of their sins. They claimed to love God, but they didn't really love God because they weren't loving one another. Okay, 2 areas that I want us to talk about today in this video. First of all, John says, God abides in us. That's the early verses of our text. We know that God abides in us from the fact that He's given us the Spirit. That's verse 13. And it's almost a word-for-word repeat of chapter 3 and verse 24. Again, how do we know that God abides in us? How do we know that He lives in us? John says, so far, there are 3 ways we can know this. First of all, we know it because we love one another. That's verse 12, and that's also verse 16 in our text for today. Because we love one another, we know that God lives in us, because God is love. In fact, John repeats that twice, doesn't he, in this letter? God is love. That's His very nature. But we also know that God lives in us because we are in possession of His Spirit. That's verse 13. And, number 3, we know that God abides in us because of the confession of faith that we are willing to acknowledge that Jesus is indeed the Son of God. That's verse 15. And by the way, John has already told us that that confession of faith is produced by the Spirit of God. Chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. So, again, he wants to assure us and assure his readers that God lives in us and that we have a good relationship with Him. And then the second part of this text, John once again wants to give his readers confidence. How does he want them to have confidence? By knowing that they love one another. We can have confidence at the judgment, John writes. Notice verse 17. How is it that we can have confidence at the judgment, that we are right with God? Well, since we love one another, we know that we already have a likeness to Christ. As Jesus is, so are we in the world. Well, if we are like Christ, God certainly is going to save us, isn't He? If we have a relationship with Christ, if there's a likeness of Christ in us, then God certainly is going to save us. So we can have confidence at the judgment because we know that we already have a likeness to Christ when we love one another. And look at verse 18. John says, perfect love casts out fear. Even now, God is in the process of perfecting or completing or fulfilling our love. And that means that we don't have to be afraid of God. We are unafraid of God because love has been perfected in our hearts. Verse 19, John says, I want you to think about the priority of divine love. God loved us first. We love because God first loved us. And then look at verses 20 and 21, where again John mentions the inseparability of the love of God and the love of one another. That is, we can't say that we love God if we don't love one another. How can we say that? We've never seen God. It sounds like a passage from John chapter 1, the Gospel of John, doesn't it? No one has ever seen God. How can we say that we love God whom we haven't seen when we don't love one another whom we have seen? That's his point. He's trying to show that you can't have it both ways. You must love one another if you love God, because God is love. Now, how shall we apply this passage to us? Well, I want to say that once again there is assurance here for us that we are right with God. Again, we don't have to wonder whether or not we are right with God. If we have these earmarks of a relationship with Him, we know that we are right with Him. But there's the further application once again that we must love one another. That's right, even those that we don't particularly like very much. John says we need to love one another in the family of God. And I think that's a challenge for each of us. That's the way that each of us can apply this passage. Are there people in the family of God for whom I find it difficult to love? People that I may not love very well. Well, my challenge is to grow in my love for them. That is, my concern for their well-being, my interest in their welfare and their goodwill. Okay. We're going to be looking at chapter 5, verses 1 through 5 in the coming days, and we're still talking about love. John's going to talk about love and the commandments. But in the last two verses, verses 4 and 5, he's going to talk about faith and victory. What is it that overcomes the world? It's our faith. Wonderful passages that strengthen us, right? I'll see you in a few days. God bless you.